Hello. Today we're going to start our discussion about chapter one of our book. As I'm sure you know by now, our book is Psychology in Everyday Life. It's the fifth edition and it's by David Myers and C. Nathan DeWall. In today's discussion, we'll take a look at the origins of psychology and also some of the different perspectives on psychology and fields of psychology. It was Hermann Ebbinghaus who said that psychology has a long history, but only a short past. What do you think Ebbinghaus meant by this statement? Well, when we look back on the development of psychology, it's only been a discipline for a little over 100 years, which isn't very long when you think about it. But going way back centuries, philosophers have had a very strong influence on the eventual development of psychology as a discipline, as has biological science and medicine as well. During our time together this semester, we'll be the beneficiaries of many different studies that have been done over the years that are helping us to have a much better understanding of ourselves and one another. And we'll look at how we can apply results from those studies in making our lives better in many ways. And thinking about how psychology got started, we need to go all the way back to Germany towards the end of the 19th century and look at the work of a psychologist named Wilhelm Wundt, who started a field of study called structuralism. Wundt was especially interested in the structure of our mind, and he tried to analyze our mind into individual components, kind of like the elements in the periodic table, but here we're talking about mental elements. Things like thoughts, feelings, memories, sensations. He would bring participants into his laboratory there in Leipzig, where he started this work around 1879. And he would put them in different situations where they would then be asked to talk about what they were experiencing. One example was he would have them listen to a metronome, a machine that keeps a beat like dot, 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 dot. So he would have them listen to the metronome at one speed, and then he would speed it up, dot, 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 or slow it down, dot, dot, dot. And he would have them talk about what they experienced inside themselves when they were listening to the metronome, what images might have come into their mind, what feelings they experienced, what thoughts they had. So he used this and several other different experimental setups in order to try to better understand what goes on in our minds. And he called this technique that he used introspection, which means that introspection means to look within. So he was having the participants to look inside themselves, within themselves, and describe their experiences. So this was the main method that the structuralists used. A bit later, in America, a psychologist named William James started a new area of psychology called functionalism. James was also interested in studying the mind, but he was more interested in what our mind does for us than with the structure of the mind itself. That is, what function does it serve us in our everyday life? And that's why his particular field came to be known as functionalism. He was also quite influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution as well. Interestingly, William James was also quite interested in the study of the psychology of religion, and he wrote a very influential book called The Varieties of Religious Experience around 1900, in which he studied people's conversion experiences. We use that book in our Psychology of Religion course here at Gardner-Webb. A little bit later, around the 1920s or so, all the way up through the mid part of the 20th century, a new field of psychology called behaviorism developed. The early research in that by Ivan Pavlov in Russia actually preceded the popularity of behaviorism in America. American psychologists involved in behaviorism include both John Watson and B.F. Skinner. We're going to be studying all these individuals and the work that they did in due time. But what set behaviorism apart from the earlier fields of psychology is that behaviorism focused on observable behavior. Behaviorists thought that it was pretty much a waste of time to try to study what goes on in your mind because you can't see it and you can't measure it. So they thought we needed to look at what people actually do and study that. So what we find then is that early on, around the turn of the century, around 1900, the focus was more on mental processes, but then a little bit later on, the focus shifted to behavior. Another interesting development is that of psychoanalysis, which was developed by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was actually a physician, trained as a neurologist. He became a psychiatrist. He was in Vienna, in Austria, and he is someone who helped us then and now to appreciate that we don't have just a conscious mind, but we also have an unconscious mind. There are things that go on in our mind that are beyond our awareness that affect our thoughts, feelings, and behavior every day. In fact, unconscious influences are greater than we might appreciate. And we're going to have an opportunity to explore that aspect of our functioning as well as we look into the unconscious mind and what that is all about. A more modern way of thinking about the unconscious mind that's talked about in your first chapter and that we'll be talking about later is that we have a two-track mind. There are things that go on a conscious level of which we're aware, and also things that go on an unconscious level that we're not aware of, but that still affect us. Another of Freud's important contributions was the appreciation that things that happen early in our lives can influence how we turn out later on. Another important field that developed in the 20th century was humanism. And the humanistic approach, championed by Abraham Maslow, focused more on normal behavior and helping us to achieve our potential as human beings and to have the best quality life possible. We'll have an opportunity to explore this humanism perspective as we go forward as well. Nowadays, when we think about psychology, a more modern way of looking at it is that psychology is a science that involves the study of both mental processes and behavior. So we're going to explore what that means to call psychology a science a little bit. And you can see here that one very important aspect of thinking about psychology as a science is that it helps us to develop critical thinking and a scientific attitude. So think about that for a moment. What does it mean to be a critical thinker and to have a scientific attitude? Does it mean that we're critical of people who don't believe the same way we do? No. It just means that we're able to ask good questions and sometimes hard questions to try to get at the truth of things. We don't just accept what people tell us. We want to dig a little deeper and check out assumptions and uh, the proof for things that people say are true. And in psychology, we go about that using the scientific method. So a scientific attitude is one that encourages us to, in a systematic way, using research methods, study how we think, how we act, how we feel, to help us gain a better understanding of our human nature. And critical thinkers don't blindly accept arguments and conclusions. Like we said before, they ask good questions to try to understand what is true. And science-aided thinkers also challenge old beliefs and forge new fact-related paths, as you can see. For example, we might hear something like opposites attract. And we might think based on that that people who are opposites make the best partners, when in fact, researchers have found that people who are similar in important ways tend to make better partners throughout life. So think about that for a moment, ways in which you are a critical thinker, and perhaps ways in which you can become even more so a critical thinker, so that you can really check out underlying assumptions and the source of things that you learn about and come to your own conclusions about what is true. Let's say that you see an advertisement for an over-the-counter pill that you can take, and the claim is that this pill helps to improve your memory. You don't have to have a prescription for it. You can just go out and buy it. And the proof that's provided to support the idea that this pill improves your memory is two testimonials. Of course, a testimonial is when a person who has taken the pill claims that it improves their memory. Would that be enough evidence for you to decide, yes, I want to take that pill too, because now I know that it improves memory? Well, if you were a critical thinker, you would probably need more than that. You might want to know if the pill has been studied scientifically. Has anyone done a study or more than one study where they compared people who took the pill with those who didn't, who perhaps took a placebo? That would be a way of having a scientific attitude and thinking about whether or not you would take that pill, what particular decision you would make in that situation. Having a scientific attitude also involves curiosity, skepticism, which we've already been talking about some, and humility. When we have a scientific attitude, we're just naturally curious about things. We want to know how things work. We want to know why things are the way they are. We ask questions, and we want to test out hypotheses that we might have about different areas. And we're skeptical. When people tell us things, we ask ourselves and maybe ask them, well, how do you know that? What is the basis for your conclusion there? And the scientific attitude also involves having humility. When we're humble, we realize that we don't have all the answers, and we realize that sometimes we're going to find an answer and sometimes we're not, even when we use a scientific approach to studying something. And if we say do a study and it doesn't turn out the way we thought it would, we go back to the drawing board and we figure out what we might want to do differently to try to answer important questions that we're asking. So when we meet a critical thinker, they tend to be able to talk about their ideas and our ideas and differences of opinion about things without getting defensive or being pushy, because they are humble and they realize that they don't have all the answers. They're just trying to figure out what the answers are and to go about it in a systematic, scientific way. That reflects a scientific attitude. So as we mentioned before, psychology is now best thought of as a science of behavior and mental processes. So when we look back on how psychology got started, we can see that in the beginning, the focus was more on mental processes, then the focus was more on behavior, but now the focus is on both. So this is a really good definition that's given here, that psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. Behavior, of course, is anything that we can observe and record. Anything a human or a non-human animal does that's of interest to be studied. And mental processes are internal states that are inferred from our behavior, and includes our thoughts, our beliefs, and our feelings. These are all different kinds of mental processes that we have. Psychology has grown so much over time. There's so many different interesting fields of study in psychology now. Some of them we'll have a chance to explore in our time together. Uh, this table lists some of the current perspectives in the field of psychology. We're not going to go over all of these now, but I encourage you to read about them in your book. You'll also find this table in your book so that you can take a look at some of the different areas that psychologists study. And thinking about the different fields of psychology today, here is a list of just some of them: biological, developmental, cognitive, personality, social, health, industrial, organizational psychology. We'll briefly go over these. Biological psychology focuses more on the body and its functioning, especially the brain, and looking at the relationship between the brain and behavior. Developmental psychology studies psychology all the way from conception all the way through to old age and death. Cognitive psychology is interested in how we think, process information, remember things. Personality psychology is interested in looking at how our personalities develop, different personality traits that we have. Social psychology is interested in how we are affected by groups of people, looking at things like obedience and authority, interpersonal attraction, attitudes, prejudice, racism, discrimination, are just some of the topics of interest to social psychology. Health psychology is interested in taking a look at things like how stress affects our health, ways in which we can cope better with stressors in our lives, how our immune system is affected by stress and how we can bolster our immune system to help keep us healthy, topics of that nature. And industrial organizational psychology is interested in the application of psychology to industry and business. Industrial organizational psychologists might do things like help develop questionnaires that could be used in the process of selecting people for jobs, helping organizations to work better together as teams, and helping figure out who's well suited for a promotion, and other types of topics like that. And there's another related area where there's an interest in looking at the actual environment in which people work and how to make it as um, healthy as possible to encourage people to be productive and to stay healthy in the workplace itself. When we begin to think about psychology, it's helpful for us to appreciate the biopsychosocial approach to things. Because one of the things that we'll come to appreciate is that in thinking about any aspect of behavior, it's never just one thing that causes us to be a certain way. It's always a combination of factors that work together. And the biopsychosocial approach helps us to appreciate that. So as you can see, it takes into account biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors that may come together to influence us. Biological factors include things like our brain and our endocrine system. Psychological factors include things like how we learn, our personalities, how we process information, our memories, things like that. And sociocultural factors include our environment, our families, how we were raised, our upbringing, if we've experienced traumas in our lives, and that kind of thing. So when we look at any aspect of what it means to be human, it's always helpful for us to approach it from a biopsychosocial point of view to take into consideration biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. One area where this is so important is when we think about psychological disorders. Because with psychological disorders, any disorder that we want to take a look at, and we will be studying them later on, with psychological disorders, it's never just one thing that causes a person to be a certain way. It's always a combination of factors. Let's just take, for example, if somebody is experiencing depression. Let's say they're experiencing the disorder called major depressive disorder, where the person is so depressed that it's interfering with their ability to function and causing them distress in their lives. And maybe they're even having thoughts about suicide, which does sometimes happen with depression. We might look at a depressed person and think, well, they probably have a chemical imbalance. And they might. By chemical imbalance, we're usually talking about neurotransmitters in the brain that may not be functioning the way they're supposed to. Maybe the levels are too low, or they're too high, or in some other way they're dysregulated. And in the case of depression, in fact, there are two neurotransmitters in particular that we'll be studying about in chapter 2 on the brain that have been implicated in depression, both serotonin and norepinephrine, the levels being too low for both of those neurotransmitters. But that's not the whole picture. There are other things that could be going on with someone who's depressed that might be causing them to have the difficulties that they're experiencing. Well, let's say that maybe they grew up in a family situation that was abusive and where they learned what some people call helplessness, and came to believe that they really don't have the ability to help make their life better. When things are going poorly, they just have to take it and accept it. That would be both a psychological and a sociocultural influence on their depression. The psychological part of it would be how they've come to believe that they can't make their life better. And the sociocultural part would have to do with the way they were raised and how that way of being raised uh, resulted in their having this belief about themselves. So they feel helpless and hopeless to help make their life better. And this, of course, would contribute even further to their being depressed. They might also have developed a certain way of thinking about themselves, where they believe that they're worthless and useless and unlovable, things like that. And then when things go wrong, it's all their fault, even when it's not. That could contribute to their being depressed. So as you can see, just using this one example to really fully understand as well as we can any psychological phenomenon, here we're talking about psychological disorders in general and major depression more specifically, we need to take a look at what's going on from a biopsychosocial perspective. Another fascinating issue in psychology is the nature-nurture issue. And this also relates to the biopsychosocial perspective because the bio part has to do more with nature and the psychosocial part has to do more with nurture. Nature, of course, has to do with our genes and how we come into this world genetically. And then nurture, of course, has to do with our environment and the many ways in which we are influenced throughout life. When you look at psychology historically, there have been people who were more nature focused and others who were more nurture focused and how they tried to understand what it means to be human. But the modern perspective takes both into account, and we realize that it's a combination of both nature and nurture that influence us to be the way that we are. We'll be exploring this some more later. One fascinating way of thinking about nature nurture is when we think about twins. Identical twins, of course, are come from the same fertilized ovum, and fraternal twins, two different eggs fertilized by two different sperm at the same time. So fraternal twins can be the same sex or they can be different sexes, as you can see here. Boy and a girl, fraternal twins. Two girls are identical twins. Then taking a look at twin studies and adoption studies also, it helps us to tease out somewhat the influence of nature and nurture on our development and how we turn out. Another of psychology's big ideas, we already mentioned that we have a two-track mind and we process information on both a conscious track and an unconscious track all the time. An example of this would be vision. Vision is a two-track system. Our visual perception track helps us to be able to think about the world. It's more on a conscious level. And our visual action track guides our moment-to-moment actions, and these occur on a more unconscious level. Another example would be memory. Some kinds of things, in order for us to remember them and recall them, we're operating on more of a conscious level. For example, if I ask you a factual question, like what is the capital of North Carolina? In order to answer that question, you would need to recall from your long-term memory that answer and provide the answer. But when you get up out of your chair and walk around a room, you don't have to tell your legs how to move. The muscles already know how to do that. It happens for you automatically. It's going on an unconscious track. These are just two examples. There are many more, and we'll be exploring them as we go along. In the mid part of the 20th century, especially after World War II, during and after, psychology became very focused on better understanding and treating psychological disorders. That area continues to be an important area in the field of psychology, in particular in the field of clinical psychology. But more contemporary psychology, while continuing to have an interest in the study of disorders, now explores many different other areas of study, including those that focus more on what's called human flourishing, that is helping us to have the best lives possible. And a modern area of psychology that looks at this particular area is called positive psychology, that we'll be learning more about. Positive psychology takes a look at what does it mean to live a good life. And as you can see, the definition of positive psychology here is the scientific study of human functioning whose goal is to discover and promote strengths and virtues that help individuals and communities to thrive. There are basically three different areas that positive psychology is interested in taking a look at. Positive emotions, positive human traits, which we could call virtues and strengths, and also positive institutions like churches, families, schools. Positive emotions would include things like gratitude, hope, and optimism. Positive psychology has come into being as a new field of psychology, really beginning around the first of the 21st century. We'll be studying about it later on, and we even have a course that just deals with positive psychology here at Gardner-Webb. For me, it's a really interesting area of study, and because it helps us to look further at what it means to lead a good life. A lot of people, when they think of psychology, think of it as a helping profession. And that is part of what psychology is and what psychologists do. These are fields in psychology and also in medicine that are involved in helping people. You can see these fields on this slide. The one field mentioned here that's not in the discipline of psychology, of course, is psychiatry. And psychiatry is a field of medicine, as you're probably aware, where the person goes to medical school and then they do a residency in psychiatry, where they learn a lot about the brain and the use of medications in helping people, as well as learning about counseling or therapy approaches. Clinical and counseling psychology are very closely related fields of psychology. Both of them involve learning how to help people through counseling and therapy. Clinical psychology traditionally is focused on more serious problems in counseling psychology, but those differences are much smaller now than they were in the past. Community psychology looks more at how the communities in which we live influences our well-being, and among other things is interested in the study of prevention of psychological problems. Positive psychology, which we mentioned earlier, is interested in looking at human flourishing and what it takes to live a good life. Positive psychology is very research oriented as a field, but it also has many practical applications to daily living, including ways in which it can be applied in counseling and therapy to help people who have sought help for themselves. Finally, in this section, I just wanted to mention uh, this idea about psychological science and what our authors call a post-truth world. And we're living in a post-truth world right now. Post-truth occurs when our emotions and beliefs tend to override acceptance of objective facts. Can you think of examples of of how this is going on in the world today? When we are not able to develop and use a scientific attitude, we are especially susceptible to a post-truth world, because we tend to base our opinions on what we're told, what we read about, maybe from sources that are not very critically thinking oriented, and we come to conclusions that really aren't based on fact or truth. And when we're talking with somebody who thinks in this way, it can be very challenging to try to have a discussion with them where we can be respectful of where they're coming from, and they can also be respectful from where we are coming from. So I hope that one of the things that will come out of our time together this semester is that we'll all be able to develop the ability to think critically and to be critical of ideas, but not of the people who hold those ideas. Thank you, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.